Hello, and I want to thank you for joining us today for this video on how you can set up your Sage BusinessWorks payroll to calculate workers' compensation. During this presentation, we'll first discuss how to set up the deduction for your workers' compensation, and then how we can set defaults on each of your employees for their workers' compensation. Then we'll do some time card entry to show how workers' compensation is calculated. And then we're going to finish with some of the reports that you will need for your workers' compensation audit. The first thing we do is we set up our deduction that's going to be used for calculating the company liability for workers' compensation. So we're going to go to Payroll, Utilities, Maintain Deductions. Now in our sample company, we already have workers' comp set up as a deduction. As a matter of fact, we have two of them, one for our sales staff and one for our service. Now the reason we have two is because we happen to have two different rates. Our service employees, when they work with service, are at a rate of 6%. When we use the sales staff, our sales staff is a rate of 5%. So you'll want to create a deduction for each one of your rates. You may have only one, or you may have, anywhere up to a dozen different rates. Now looking at the workers' comp sales in our sample company, we've given an ID and a description. And for the method, you need to check your method may be different. Most workers' compensation methods are a percent of the base hourly pay. As far as the category, we're going to select company system. Now you have in the category several selections: individual, system, company individual, and company system. Now I want to take a moment and discuss the categories. We can look at that by clicking on the question mark and selecting About Maintain Deductions. In our electronic help files, if we scroll down to On the Form, we can select Category, and we'll see that we have four selections: Individual, System, Company Individual, or Company System. Now if I selected Individual, that means this is an employee paid deduction, and it's going to affect each employee differently. So I would enter that rate specifically for that employee under Maintain Employees. System means, again, this is an employee paid deduction, but the rate or the amount of this deduction is going to be the same for every employee. So it's easier just to set up a system-wide deduction and then add that deduction to the employee and Maintain Employees. Company individual is now a company paid deduction, but it's going to affect each employee differently. So the company's paying it, but the rate is going to be different for each individual employee. Company system is again a company paid deduction, but the rate or the amount of that deduction is going to be the same for each employee. So now when I close out of here, I have selected company system for my category, and that is because the rate for my workers' comp for all those who work in sales is going to be the same rate. We then enter our credit and debit accounts. You'll have to select those based on your general ledger chart of accounts, and then you enter your rate. For me, the rate is 5%. You want this to be active always or from a specific time period. For workers' comp, it should be active always. For our tax categories, we want to uncheck everything. This is workers' comp is company paid, but is not taxable to any of our employees. If you check these boxes, it's going to add this deduction, that whatever it calculates for the deduction, it's going to add that amount to the employee's taxable pay. So you want to make sure that these are unchecked. We don't need to select anything for the tax category, and for the workers' comp code, you can select whatever number you want to associate with this. For sample company, we selected that our workers' comp sales is going to be workers' comp code number 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at our workers' comp service. We've done the same thing with workers' comp service. We've set it as a percent of base hourly pay. It is a company system. We did create our credit and debit accounts. We assigned those, and then we put the rate for any one of my employees who works as service. It's going to be at a rate of 6%. There is no limit, and it's always active. Over here on the taxable columns, we've unchecked everything. This is not taxable to our employees. The tax category is none, and for my sample company, the workers' comp code number we've selected as number 2. Now this is a number that you can assign to your workers' comp codes. Now in the W-2 button, we have nothing on the right hand side because that has to do with the W-2. But if you do want this to calculate on regular hours, vacation hours, sick leave hours, and overtime hours, you'll want to make sure all of these are checked. And then we say OK. So this is basically how we set up our deduction. We've set up each one of our deductions. I have a workers' comp sales and I have a workers' comp service. Each one of these is set up as a percent of base hourly pay. It's a company system. I've put the rate on each of my deductions. I have unchecked the taxable. This is not a taxable deduction. I've assigned a number to my workers' comp deduction. And in the W-2 button, I've included if I want this deduction to calculate on vacation, sick, and overtime hours as well as regular hours. Once you've set up your deduction, you'll want to save this. Now, if your company also has task codes set up, and your task codes can be coordinated with the workers' compensation, then what we can do is go into your payroll, utilities, maintain task codes, and under your task code you can select to assign the workers' comp number that would coordinate with this task code. So if my assembly was workers' comp service, then I would select workers' comp code 2. That way it just sets it as a default and makes it easier for you when you're trying to enter your time cards. And we can save this. If we had sales, our bicycle sales, then that would go to our workers' comp code 1 because that was our workers' comp deduction for our sales. Now the next step is to add the workers' comp to your employee. So I'm going to go in to maintain employees, and I've got a new employee that I've created. Their name is Jones, Jackie Jones. We're now going to go into the pay info. And I'm going to pay my employee on a weekly basis, hourly, and we'll give them $20 an hour. It just is easier to calculate. And now I can assign a task code. So I can say that my Jones employee works on assembly. And the workers' comp code is going to be 2. And again, this isn't set in stone. This is just acts as a default when you're entering a time card. So we'll say OK. I now need to add the deductions. So I'm going to add the workers' comp deductions to each one of my employees. For this training, I'm only going to use the one employee. I'm also going to add both of the workers' comp deductions because my employee may work in sales. They may also do some work that's associated with service. So I'm going to first add the workers' comp sales, and you can see that it's grayed out at the 5% rate. And then I'm going to do the workers' comp service, and we can see that it's active and at the rate of 6%. So again, if I did need to change my rates, I would have to do that on the deduction and maintain deductions. We're going to go into payroll processing time card entry. We'll pull up our Jackie Jones employee. They're going to have regular hours. Task code is set to assembly, and you can see because we have task code assembly, it's defaulting to the workers' comp code 2. It's an hourly rate of $20, and I'm going to have 30 hours going to the assembly. We need to add another regular hours, but this time Jackie was working in sales. And you can see now that sales is associated with Workers' Comp Code 1, and it defaulted to that because I set up my task codes under the payroll utilities maintain task codes to assign the Workers' Comp Code 1 to my task code of sales. This is how we can get the program to work for us. And I'll accept that and save. Now, when we calculate our time card, we'll do the automatic payroll calculation. Now we'll calculate our time card and we'll do it just for our employee Jones, and we'll say OK. And now I do want to look at my payroll register, and what we can see is it's calculated the workers' comp of $10 for sales, and that's based on the 5%, and $36 on the service. So remember, we had 10 hours of sales, of workers' comp sales at $20 an hour, which is the $200, and it calculated 5% of the $200. And then we had workers' comp service, we had 30 hours at $20 an hour, which was $600. And our workers' comp service rate was 6%. So the 6% times the $600 was $36. So this is how we get our Sage BusinessWorks to calculate the workers' compensation. Now I want to take a moment and show you some of the common calls we get in support and some of the reasons that possibly workers' compensation may not be calculating for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to our maintain deductions. And we want to make sure that when you select your workers' comp deduction, you set it up that you have assigned a workers' comp number to your deduction. This is important, and it needs to be different. So my workers' comp sales needs to have a different number than my workers' comp service. When I do my task codes and I set up my task codes, if I'm using task codes, I need to assign the workers' comp code that's associated with this task code. Now, it's not necessary that you do assign a workers' comp code, but if we leave this blank and we have none, it's not going to act as a default, and you're going to have to remember to do this each time that you enter a time card entry, and we'll look at that next. We're going to save that, and now for the sales, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select the sales, but I'm going to say none. Okay, so now when we do the time card entry, we're going to bring up our employee again. And this time I'm going to remove the line items and we're going to do the same time card entries. So we're going to do the regular pay. And this time we're going to do assembly. And we do assembly and we're going to do 30 hours. Now we can see that it did go to Workers' Comp Code 2. All right, we're now going to go to our second line item, and our second line item, we're changing our task code to sales. Now you see how the sales did not default to the workers' comp code. There is no workers' comp code, it just says none. Now if you ignore that, it's not going to calculate the workers' comp for the 10 hours of sales. We're going to go ahead and do that just for purposes of this demonstration. Now, I wanted to mention on this one, the reason that it defaulted to Workers' Comp Code 2 is because when we set up our employee, we set up our employee as a default that their task code ID was assembly and their Workers' Comp Code was 2. Let's take a look at that. If we go into payroll, employees, maintain employees, we have our employee set up under pay info as task code of assembly workers comp code 2. So that served as a default. When we selected a different task code other than assembly, it then did not give us any workers comp code on our time card entry. Now for this demonstration, let's go ahead and do an automatic payroll calculation again, and let's see how it calculates. Preview it to the screen and look at our payroll register, and we can see now that the only workers' compensation that was calculated was the $36 on our 30 hours of service when we selected the 30 hours of assembly. Let's go back into our time card and let's set up the time card correctly now. So we want to look at our first line item. This is assembly, but the workers' comp code needs to be number 2. We'll accept that. Our second line item is for sales, and it is workers' comp code number 1, and we can save that. We'll calculate our time card. Let's take a look at our payroll register, and we can see that it is now calculated exactly as we want it to calculate. Let's go ahead and close out of here, and we will post the check. And for purposes of this training, I'm just going to do a hand check for my employee, and then we'll go ahead and post this. Now that I've posted my payroll check, I can check also in my general ledger. I'm going to run my journal report. We'll do it for today's journal entries. And here's the paycheck that I just posted, and we can see that it is now tracking our workers' compensation. I have workers' compensation expense and I have a payables. Let's do a recap now of the setup of your workers' compensation. You first want to set up your deduction under payroll, utilities, maintain deductions. You will need to create a separate deduction for each one of your workers' comp rates. The method should most likely be percent of a base hourly pay. Again, that's going to be based on your workers' compensation. Most are percent of base hourly pay. The category should be company system because this is a company paid deduction. And system-wide means that the rate that you assign is going to be the same for every employee that is assigned to this workers' comp code. Then you'll want to, of course, select your credit and debit accounts and enter the rate. Do not check any of the taxable boxes on the right-hand side because workers' comp is not taxable to the employees. You'll want to associate a number with your workers' comp code. This is important. This number must be different for each one of your workers' comp deductions. Select the W-2 button and select whether or not to include on regular hours, overtime, vacation, and sick time. Once you have your deductions set up and you've assigned the number to each one of them, if you do use task codes, select payroll, utilities, maintain task codes, and select the workers' comp number, that is associated with this task code. So my task code assembly is going to be service, so I'm going to select number 2 and save that. My workers' comp sales should be associated with my sales task code, so I'm going to select workers' comp number 1. Now what this has done is created a nice template when I am entering time cards. The next step is to go into maintain employees, and as a default you can always go to the pay info, assign a default task code and a default workers' comp code. Again, those can be changed on the time card entry. This is just default only. You then need to go to the deductions button and you need to assign the workers' comp deductions to your employee. Now, if you feel that this employee is only going to be working in sales, for example, then we don't need to add the workers' comp service. But if you think your employee may be working in different tasks that would be considered a different workers' comp rate, you need to add each of those deductions to the employee. When you enter the time card, you want to make sure that your employee, if you are selecting task codes, then the workers' comp code is going to already by default be assigned to that task code. You do want to make sure though, if I change this to sales, I want to make sure that the number that is assigned, the workers' comp number that is assigned is going to be calculating for my workers' comp sales. So again, this number is real important. It's all about the number. Let's move on to the reports that we have available. We always have under the payroll reports deductions report, we can get our period activity report. Now our period activity report, we can get it a summary by employee, we can get the detail by employee or department. We're going to get the detail by employee. You can select the specific deduction that you want. For this demonstration, we're going to look at our workers' comp. So we're going to look at the workers' comp sales and we're going to look at the workers' comp service. And we can look for the current pay period, which is what we just did today. And we can see that we have our employee and we see the paycheck number, the date of the paycheck, and the amount of workers' comp that was calculated on that paycheck for the workers' comp sales and workers' comp service. We can also get it just broken down by the deduction if you wanted to see only the detail by the deduction. We then could do the same thing and we could ask to see our workers' comp sales and our workers' comp service. And now it's going to show us each one of our deductions with a breakdown of the detail and the employee's payroll checks and the workers' comp calculated during that time period. So that report will give you a breakdown of the detail of the workers' comp that's been calculated for each one of your payrolls. We also have a report that's very handy when it's time for your workers' comp audit. This report is found under Payroll, Reports, and then we have the Employee Reports, Employee Lists. And when we click on the lookup here, we have several reports. We have one called the Employee Hours List. I'm going to accept that. And here we can select the employee ID, their status, and the check dates. So most audits, workers' comp audits, will go for a year's time frame. So you would want to probably select between a certain date. I'm going to go ahead and select from 1/2017 to 12/31/2017 and preview this to the screen. And what you're going to see is that this is showing us our employee, their social security number, how much they had in regular hours, overtime, any overtime 2 and 3, any holiday pay, vacation pay, and the gross pay. So this is really handy and what your workers' comp auditors are looking for, because it does give you each employee's total of their regular hours and regular pay, their overtime breakdown of overtime hours and overtime pay, any holiday hours and holiday pay, vacation, and gross pay. So this is a good report to give to your auditor when he comes in for your workers' comp audit. I want to show you how to find that report again. It's under Payroll, Reports, Employee Reports, Employee Lists. Click on the lookup. We have a number of reports. This report is called the Employee Hours List. You'll want to select the check date of the time period of your workers' comp audit. This concludes our training on setting up your Sage BusinessWorks to calculate workers' compensation. Thank you for joining us.